such a beautiful song. It's a new favorite of many of us, isn't it? Today, Kate Stewert will be speaking to us about faith, health, and COVID. Kate began her career as a physical therapist and not only practiced in many different settings with everyone from children to elders, but also is active in teaching. She currently works for Geriatric Resources as a thoughtful engagement specialist. You'll have to ask her about that. It's a fascinating opportunity. Pastor Brady heard her presentation at our speaker series earlier this fall and felt that this would be a great presentation for this first week of the new year. Please join me in welcoming Kate Stewert.
Good morning. Lord, may the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight today. Thank you, Lisa, for that lovely introduction. I became acquainted with United Church of Sun City, as Lisa said, when she contacted my company, Geriatric Resources, the company I work for, not my company, to come and have a conversation about how we manage life in a post-COVID world. And as we all know, there's only one little problem with that. The post-COVID world hasn't arrived yet. So I thank you for your willingness to soldier on through this time. And before we begin, I'd actually like to ask if any of you remember a play or a movie called Godspell. Oh, that makes me happy. Godspell was a play written 50 years ago, so we're dating ourselves a little bit. But it was written by a young college student who, in the 1970s, just wanted a more authentic experience of God and church, and later songs were added, one of which I was so thrilled at Lisa's reading this morning was based entirely on Psalm 103. And the movie and the play were very biblically accurate, taken almost word for word from the Gospel of Matthew. But it was the music. It was the music that spoke to me when my big brother was in the play and I would sit outside his door and listen to him rehearse. And the songs I remember to this day. And so I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge your music ministers. What beautiful, beautiful work this morning. Your parish nurse, Lisa, knew that we definitely had to have a conversation about the pandemic because it impacted all of us so drastically. And when you've been through that kind of change, that kind of unprecedented experience, it's important for a community like United Church to come together and kind of regroup. Where do we go from here? And I think we're still learning that as we go. Being part of a faith community has many advantages. And your entire staff here at United Church make it a point to follow up with each of you about how things are going, about your family and your life and your health, and what a gift that is. Of the churches that I've attended, none had a parish nurse. So Lisa was my first experience of someone filling that role, and what a magnificent thing to do. Because I've always believed that faith and health are intertwined. As Lisa said, in addition to my work as a thoughtful engagement specialist, I've been a physical therapist for 35 years. And I've had the privilege of helping so many people find their new normal after an illness or an injury. But that also means I've watched people live through and navigate some of the hardest days of their lives. Sometimes some of the hardest years of their lives. And when a When I would meet someone who was a member of a church, I noticed something very unique. That even when the going was really tough, they were surprisingly peaceful. Which is not to say that they were worry-free, but I noticed the way a church community would rally around someone during a time of illness. And I noticed that for all of us, when a frightening thing happens to us, when a tragic thing happens to us, even as people of faith, we're going to sometimes have that heartbreaking moment. Why did this happen to me or to my loved one? And where is God in this experience? It's true that people of faith ask those questions, but I noticed among my patients that people who attended church also asked some other questions. They asked, well, why not me? Could there be an unexpected blessing in this experience that I couldn't have anticipated? And does this give me a unique opportunity to lean on God's mercy and love? The ability to pose uplifting questions to ourselves is a form of resiliency. This is just one definition of resiliency, an ability to recover or to adjust easily to adversity or change, the capacity to recover quickly when things go off script. But this is one of the ways that I measure resiliency. How do we explain misfortune to ourselves? Everyone in this room knows that a faith-filled life does not guarantee smooth sailing. And it doesn't mean that you will have escape from sorrow or from grief. But a faith-filled life, I believe, gives us more ways to cope when those heartbreaking situations arise. A faith-filled life invites us to build our resiliency muscles. As a healthcare provider, I was humbled over and over when I saw how resilient my patients could be. When something unspeakable had happened and their lives had changed, maybe forever, but they found a way to change the meaning of that experience. And there couldn't be a better way to describe what happened to all of us when COVID-19 entered our lives. I don't think it's an understatement to say that COVID-19 turned the whole world upside down. And 2 years ago, right now, we couldn't have imagined what the implications were going to be. COVID was an unprecedented experience in our generation. And it was a frightening foe. And fear can create divides within families and within communities. Because I was a physical therapist, I was used to wearing a mask, but for many people, it took on an emotional charge. It's fair to say that we got a lot of conflicting information about mask use, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic. But that's only natural when you're trying to manage an evolving crisis. Some people felt that mask use was an infringement on their rights. Some people felt that it protected their health and the health of their loved ones. But this next slide is how Pastor Brady articulated it. When I first came to United Church, the sign that I saw on the door said, "All masks are welcome, but not required if you're vaccinated." Now, I thought that was brilliant and compassionate. It acknowledged all sides of the issue, and it said, "You're welcome here. Take care of yourself. Do what feels right to you." Now, that was back in September, and I'm sure you all noticed coming in here this morning, the sign has changed again. But that's because new information is coming in. And your faith leaders here at United are always looking for the best information to give you to protect yourselves. As a faith community, we are asked to practice compassion on many levels, particularly for people who see the world or certain issues differently than we do. So this was another layer of the COVID experience. Certainly, the pandemic pushed us farther away from one another, but in many ways, we found ourselves interacting with far more people than we would normally interact with because of the different opinions and worries and fears that arose. And I believe that part of faith is responding to the needs of others while still caring compassionately for ourselves. One of the ways we care for ourselves is to consciously choose the way we're going to cope with a stressful situation. Now, that's a pretty noisy slide, and I apologize for that, but I'm going to go ahead and read it, because to me, this one definition encompasses so much of what coping is. Coping represents the cognitive and behavioral efforts of an individual to manage the internal and external demands encountered during a specific stressful situation. And what that means to me is that when we are confronted with stress, we're managing our own thoughts about it, our fears, our history, how do we interpret what's happening? And then we have to manage our behaviors. What are we going to choose to do out in the world? And then when we get out in the world, we're confronted with the behaviors of other people too. So that's a lot to be balancing and juggling. When we were faced with COVID-19, I think for many of us, things were changing so quickly that our coping mechanisms couldn't keep up with what we were experiencing. For people of faith, one of the most powerful forms of coping is to deepen our spiritual practice. That may mean spending more time in prayer. It may mean checking in on a neighbor and mobilizing to make sure that they have what they need. And it may mean strengthening family ties and making a more concerted effort to stay in touch. What I know from just standing in the back of this church this morning is that that's what the entire United community does. You keep tabs on each other. And your staff have done that before the pandemic, to say nothing of throughout the pandemic. And what an inspiring thing. This is exactly what the staff does here on a daily basis. I mentioned earlier that there are benefits to being a part of a faith community. Each of you already know them, or I don't think you'd be here. But there might be a little more to it than you know, because there have been a number of studies conducted in the area of where health and faith intersect. From the Journal of Religion and Health, there was a study where people who were heart transplant recipients, and I don't know if any of you know anybody who's been through that, but it is a very lengthy process. But this study found that those people who were active members of a church community after a heart transplant had much better outcomes than people who were not. Another study asked women who were going through cancer treatment to identify what helped them get through that process. And do you know that 93% of them said it was their spiritual practice and prayer? But this study, this third one is kind of my favorite. 1,700 older adults agreed to have their blood drawn and analyzed. And what they discovered was that people who were members of a faith community had immeasurably improved immune response according to their blood work. Now I just love that, because when we're asked a question or when we complete a survey, we might bend the truth a little bit, but a blood test doesn't lie. So the beautiful thing is that just by being here, Just being in these pews and being part of this community, you are bolstering not only your spiritual practice, but your health as well. As people of faith, most of us enjoy being helpful and being of service. Lisa has told me stories of how all of you have come forward in different ways and at different times to meet the needs of your fellow parishioners. And helping other people is a wonderful form of self-care. But it can be a different story when we need the help. Many of us are happy to give the help, but are very uncomfortable when we need to receive it. My mom used to say that when we have to call someone and ask for help, the phone suddenly weighs 500 pounds. But we do a real disservice to ourselves if we don't reach out when we need that help and support, because none of us are getting any younger as the years go by. And our bodies take notice of that fact. Invariably, just like a classic car, some of our parts are going to wear out. And so it's inevitable that we are going to have health challenges. Some of us more than others, certainly. But being part of a faith community, it doesn't mean you're never going to get sick. It does, however, mean that when you do need help and support, you have a group of like-minded people who will reach out and help you through that time. And so I invite you, the next time that you could use some support from your community, pick up that 500-pound phone and make the call. Because it's a circle. Giving and receiving, they complement each other. I thank you all for inviting me to be part of your day-to-day, and I thank Pastor Brady, Lisa, Robin, and Steve, and the entire staff for making this such a lovely experience. I thank you all for using your faith to build your resiliency. I thank you for being a community that both gives and receives support and feels free to do that. And I thank you for your kindness to me and to one another. And again, I thank Pastor Brady and your entire faith team for their service and dedication. And I'd like to leave you with this thought. Both faith and joy are just as contagious as fear and panic. Choose well. We thank you, God, for this opportunity to gather today, to hear your word and take it with us into the new year as we build community and build resiliency together.